Hello. This video is going to cover Chapter 2, Section 4, which talks about the cultural achievements of the Egyptians, the things that we would identify as being part of Egyptian civilization. So let's get to it. Um, the first thing to consider when you think about Egypt's civilization or the culture of Egypt, you have to think about the fact that their culture is an extremely optimistic one. And this optimism comes from their river source, their geography, the Nile. You'll remember that in Mesopotamia, where the rivers were very violent and unpredictable and required a lot of work and labor to make them useful for agriculture, in Egypt, the Nile was almost the exact opposite. It was extremely calm, very fruitful, with very little work involved. It was very easy for them to live as a society. And so their outlook on life is based on this idea that everything is taken care of for them, that the world is sort of perfectly set up for them. And as a result, the Egyptians had this very positive worldview, this optimistic worldview, which contrasts really sharply with the Mesopotamian pessimistic worldview. This had a side effect of making them think that the world was sort of lawful, orderly, kind of perfectly arranged for them, divinely ordained. And they called this concept Ma'at, this idea of orderliness or law or justice. They thought that the world operated in an orderly way, unlike the Mesopotamians, who thought, again, because of their rivers, that the world operated in a chaotic way. So we're not surprised when we don't see any crazy law codes coming out of Egypt, because they didn't feel the need to impose order on the world around them because it's already orderly in their mindset. This also leads to a sort of superiority complex for the Egyptians. The Egyptians thought that Egyptian culture was better than everyone else's because, well, just look around. Look at how our world, our society seems to just function without everybody getting so stressed out about everything. Look at how our river is so awesome without any real effort being put in. So the Egyptians were really thought that their society was the best there was. And they always think about other cultures in a sort of negative way. They talk about interacting with other cultures as if it was corrupting or contaminating. So we have this superiority complex among the Egyptian worldview. And then you take all that together and you say, well, why would we want to change things? If we're the best culture and everything around us is great, why would we ever change? And so the Egyptians have this very conservative streak where they are very slow to change their culture. Their culture does not adapt quickly. So if they start doing things one way, it might take hundreds of years for that thing to change, where in another culture, it might change very rapidly. Their art style is like this. Their writing systems, which we'll talk about, for example, are like this, specifically hieroglyphics, but we'll talk about that on a subsequent slide. The Egyptian religion was constantly interacting with all of the other elements of life for the Egyptians. Like all ancient cultures, it's very hard to separate religion from everyday life. Their gods were polytheistic, meaning that there were many gods. And their gods showed both human characteristics, or what we would call anthropomorphism, and zoomorphic characteristics, or animal-like qualities. We'll talk more about the gods in a separate discussion, a separate talk. But the three gods that you really need to know that are listed in our textbook are Amun-Ra, or Amun-Re, who was the source of the pharaoh's authority. He was the god that when the Egyptians looked around and said, why should we listen to Pharaoh? They would say, this god gives me the power, me, the pharaoh, the power. Osiris and Isis are important because they're involved in the afterlife, and we'll talk about that on a subsequent slide. They also are great for the anthropomorphic quality of the gods. They're married to each other like humans are. They have little squabbles and jealousies, and people kill one of them. Osiris gets killed, and Isis brings him back to life. You can see the humanness of the gods in their backstory. I always like to talk about Akhenaten as a counterpoint to all this. He was a pharaoh who was extremely obsessed with this very minor sun god called Aten, so much so that he changed his name to Akhenaten, with Aten at the end there. And he decided he wanted to convert Egypt from a polytheistic religious system to a henotheistic system. That is, a system where there are many gods, but there's only one god that's really important. In his mind, that one god was this weird minor sun god named Aten. And so he did a lot to Egypt's culture to try to convert it. He moved the capital. He kind of like changed the religion around, built temples to this Aten god that nobody really cared about. Um, but of course, the conservative bent of the Egyptians meant that nobody really liked these changes. And so when he died, his reforms were all very unsuccessful. They undid all of his political things, like moving the capital, but they also reverted the religion. They made Amun the chief god again, and they destroyed all the temples that Akhenaten had built. So Akhenaten is a really great example of the worldview of the Egyptians clashing with new ideas. So if you ever need an example for how the Egyptians are conservative and optimistic and they don't like things changing, Akhenaten's reign is a really good example of that. The Egyptian afterlife was a very positive one, as you might expect from a positive culture like the Egyptians. They looked at life in after death as being similar to life on Earth. Just everything was improved, everything was better compared to the Mesopotamians, for instance, who thought that death was like life but worse. So to get to the afterlife, you had to pass various tests and trials. You had to answer questions. Your heart would be weighed against the feather of truth. The feather being the symbol of Ma'at, that concept that we talked about on a previous slide. And if you failed, your soul would be destroyed. But if you passed, you would go to the happy field of food for eternity. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in just a second. But one of the reasons why we know all this is because we have these texts, all different texts, called the Book of the Dead, which is a sort of instruction manual for dead people that would be included in every burial in the Egyptian religion that contained all sorts of things to help the dead person along. So spells and directions and charms and all sorts of things that would be useful for this dead person, including diagrams such as this one, which showed the actual process of how a soul was judged. You can see the weighing of the heart there in the center. You can see Osiris and the big guy in the chair on the right-hand side. You can see the rows of judges in the top left asking questions of the dead person. So you can see all these elements here. And part of the reason for that is these funerary texts that were left behind in the graves of those who had died, these sort of instruction manuals, instruction guides. Now, the way that these bodies were prepared for the afterlife was that they had to be mummified. Everybody would be buried with their stuff, but what was interesting about the Egyptians is that they preserved the body because they thought, just like all the grave goods that you were going to take with you, your body would be something that you would need to use later on. And so they preserved the bodies through a variety of means. There's a difference between what we would call a spontaneous mummy, that is a mummy that happens by accident through random chance. If a person dies and falls into a frozen lake and then gets frozen over and preserved for thousands of years, that would be a spontaneous mummy. Or the same thing can happen in the desert. If somebody dies in the desert and their body is dried out by the heat and the sun and is buried, that body would then become preserved completely accidentally. And we call that spontaneous mummy. But the mummies that we think of with Egypt are anthropogenic mummies, which means man-made mummies. And originally, these mummies were only something that very important people, rulers and nobility, could do because it was so expensive and so costly to preserve the body in this way. Because of all the materials needed and the time investment, it was a very, very rare thing. And later on, as more people got more powerful in the Egyptian world, we start to see mummification of less famous, less noble, less upper class people. Still an expensive process, but still primarily it expanded out. They wouldn't just preserve your whole body; they would actually prepare it. So they would take things out of your body, all of your organs, and wrap those up and place them in these special jars called canoptic jars, which were used to preserve the organs because you would need those when you were dead. But the body would decay more quickly if they were left inside. So you take them out, preserve them separately, and then you use that empty cavity that's left behind to help preserve the human body after death. Um, and you can look up the details on how these things were made, but it was a very costly process, and it took months and months. But there was a lot of reason to do it. And the reason to go through such great lengths was because in the Egyptians' view of the afterlife, that body would be the home of two of your three souls. So when you died, you had this three-part soul. One part of your soul, called the Ka, was basically like a ghost of you that lived right with the body, and had to eat and drink and would enjoy all the stuff that you left behind. So you needed to preserve that body, because if you didn't, then that part of your soul wouldn't have anywhere to reside. The second part of your soul that did interact with the body still was called the Ba. And it was sort of like a ghost that could fly around and visit different places and wander the earth, and enjoy all the stuff that could be found on the earth. But every night it would have to return to the body to sort of recharge. Um, Finally, there was a third part of the soul, which was called the Akh, and that was the part of the soul that lived in the tomb. That leaves the tomb and lives with the gods, or in the heavens or the underworld. Um, so you need your body for two out of your three souls that you potentially could have as a dead Egyptian. And therefore, we had to go through a lot of real effort to make sure that your body and all your organs that were needed were preserved properly.